Hello, everybody. Welcome to Strategy and Future. Today, my guest is Professor Julian Lindley-French, chairman of Alphen Group. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Jacek. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. We haven't talked to each other in a while. In the meantime, you kept writing your essays about the turmoil, about the geopolitical tensions and situation, of course, war in Ukraine and things around it. Recently, you wrote a piece about sort of the as a challenge to Kissinger's perspective, and I'd like to start our conversation with this. Uh, could you tell our audience, what do you think? What is strange in how Kissinger has been approaching this war in Ukraine and the great power game that is unfolding? Let's maybe get started with this, general question.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a fan of Kissinger's writing over the years, but I did think that his recent piece on how to avoid World War III was the piece of an unreconstructed realist that took no account of the fact that certain states, when they're led by certain people, behave in very bizarre ways. And Kissinger was calling on effectively, that Russia must be maintained as a pillar of the of the international system. Well, yeah, but this Russia with this man in charge, I mean, it's if you're going to have pillars of a system, you've got to be fairly sure that the pillar can be relied upon. This pillar, this Russia we're dealing with at the moment, is quixotic, it's unstable, its behavior is irrational. So I'm afraid that at the moment we have to contain and deter Russia, as well as engaging Russia through Ukraine. The idea of building a partnership with Russia to maintain the stability of the global system, well, that will come later. I think the concerns that I have about this Russia are increasingly shared in Beijing as well. So, Russia is isolating itself. Russia has basically made it clear it doesn't want to be part of the rules-based order. It wants to be a consistent defector. It wants to pretend to have agreements and treaties and then at the key moment defect, causing maximum impact and damage. And you just cannot build a sustainable relationship with a state like that. You Poles, of all people, know that only too well.
Oh, but it is interesting you mentioned Beijing. So you still you sort of think that Beijing is also not happy with the revisionist approach of Russia, this Russia, because of what? Because Beijing wants to keep the globalization on, going on, or because of the correlation of power, or because of the threats of use of nuclear weapon, which would also undermine the Chinese position in the Western Pacific, relatively at least. So, what are the reasons for this, as you presume, to behavior of Beijing?
Primarily because Russia's behavior in the last 12 months has confirmed the Chinese prejudice that the Russians are idiots, that they're incompetent,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is always a danger that this Russia will drag China into conflicts that China doesn't see as its interests. We in the West, in North America and Europe in particular, might think that what Russia has done is awful. It clearly is, but there are many countries around the world who simply don't want to get dragged into this or don't buy the Western narrative. But increasingly, Russia's brutality and incompetence is shifting them towards a position of, if not anti-Russian, being very skeptical about Russia, allied to its incompetent conduct of the war. And then you have China, which has grown rich and powerful on the back of globalization and its supply chains, which is now in a post-COVID crisis, which wants to recover the fundamentals of power, i.e. wealth and prosperity, before it can consider any other geopolitical démarche. And Russia is undermining it. China at some point could well decide to break its relations with the West, but it doesn't want an incompetent Russia doing it for China.
Yeah.
It wants to manage. The Chinese Communist Party are control freaks. And the thing about Putin is he's becoming increasingly irrational and uncontrollable. And Beijing simply does not like that.
Yeah, let alone that, in my personal opinion, Russia wanted to improve its geopolitical status by invading and potentially quickly seizing Kiev and removing Zelensky and his government, improving his position vis-a-vis China, and play a new game towards the continental Europeans, probably removing United States and present itself in a different light vis-a-vis Beijing as a more independent player for China. So, and it backfired, so to speak, right? And
Big time.
would you
Big
share
time.
big time? Yeah. Would you concur with the following opinion that if the Chinese were not savvy enough over the last 12 months, and if they were not refraining from their version of land lease, yeah, sort of, maybe we would really fall into World War III by this time.
Yes, I think there was a danger of that. The Chinese have made various utterances of support, of modest support for Russia, but at the same time maintaining relations with the West, including NATO. And their military support for Russia has been negligible, forcing the Russians to take fairly desperate measures with the likes of Iran.
Mhm.
China simply is looking at this askance. The Russians have been incompetent at every level. I mean, the very strategy that Putin and his clique somehow convinced themselves would return Russia to some kind of uh, pre 1990 global status was doomed to begin because the fundamentals of Russia are fundamentally weak. And they're weak because the regime has refused to modernize the Russian state and its society for the 21st century. One only has to contrast the reforms that have taken place in Poland since 1990 with what's not happened inside Russia since 1990 to see that this is a desperate attempt to return the world back to, if not the 20th century, even the 19th century.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah. You
But
know,
Russia has not the power to do that.
exactly. And coming back to the Kissinger's claim, as we were reading his stuff, recently here in Warsaw. So what struck us most acute was that in Kissinger's realistic terms, Russia doesn't deserve to be a great power. That's why it's not a pillar of the international system, and that was proven at the gates of Kiev and the following battles that Russia lost. Simply put, and that introduced
Hmm.
Ukraine as a entity, geopolitical entity that has a say in the security matters of Central and Eastern Europeans, or AKA in the Intermarium, as we call it here in Warsaw.
Yeah,
Uh, and, uh, and that changes the balancing game across the European continent, uh, changing the matrix that especially the Germans and the French are being used to since the Congress of Vienna and the times of Napoleon, with Russia being a European player big time, right? It's out of the system, and the war was initiated to become a player in Europe, and it was,
correct.
and at Kiev it was refrained. I mean, it was stopped from having this chance. So even in Kissinger's realist, I'm not sure if you concur with how we perceive it. So that changes the situation, and my question is, do you believe that in Berlin and in Paris, which, as you can imagine, in Warsaw, are not seen as really all over in favor of Ukraine and the war, are they coming to terms with the reality that Russia has not proven to be a great power to have an impact on the European system of balance of power, or not yet?
I think the French are more than the Germans. Um, and in your response to Kissinger's piece, yes, you're right. But Kissinger's historical analogy was simply wrong. For example, he deliberately used the suggestion about what caused World War One at the beginning of the piece And it reflected an American conceit about both World War One and World War Two, which is simply wrong. World War One was not caused by great powers sleepwalking into war. The British and the French were desperate to stop it and tried, but at the same time they couldn't simply allow Prussia, the Prusso-German Wilhelmine Germany, to build up its army and its navy without a response. Now, Russia was the great uncertainty in all this. And I don't agree with Kissinger that since the Congress of Vienna, Russia has always been a player in Europe. It's always been an external player to Europe that has occasionally been involved. The business of Europe has been primarily dictated by the British, the French, and the Germans since 1815, until the Americans came in after 1945. The Russians have always been an external actor and an unstable, backward actor. Kissinger was, of course, at the height of his powers during the Cold War, the early 70s. I remember it well. And there, the Soviet Union had a moment in the sun, to quote Kaiser Wilhelm. And I think for that reason, in fact, Kissinger's assumptions about Russia were profoundly wrong, which is why I wrote the piece. If you get your historical analogy wrong, then everything that flows after it is suspect. And that was the point I'm making, that this Russia has never really been part of the system and can never be relied upon to be part of Kissinger's system, because its method of statecraft is to defect and defect and defect at the most dangerous moment to the West. And this is it tried to do in Ukraine, and it suddenly discovered how weak a power it is. Now, the only thing that's really preventing, I think, a major Ukrainian advance is still Western ambivalence over what to do. Now, the Americans and the British are prepared to go significantly further than, say, the Germans. But much of Putin's obsession is not with the Americans or the British. Whatever Patrushev said last week about this being a war with America and Britain, Germany is the obsession of the regime. Always has been. And what we've seen over the last week is far from Zeitenwende. We've seen a kind of here andet sicht nicht viel. Nothing changes here. It's not just the lack of Leopard 2s that Germany's offering to the Ukrainians because they're still an offensive weapon. How can they be offensive in a defensive war? But anyway,
Yeah.
But it's also blocking other countries with Leopard 2s from giving them to the Ukrainians. And you're left with the kind of bizarre situation where the British are offering 48 Challenger 2 main battle tanks, which would mean that the Ukrainians would end up operating about 6 different systems.
Yeah.
And it would take a year to train all of them to operate all of these systems with different ammunition, different spare parts. Far from transferring the strength of NATO into Ukraine, we're actually transferring the very problems that NATO grapples with every week. Different systems of different countries with different standards. This is not strategy as such, and that's my concern. And until Germany comes on board, the French will always witter around. They'll play politics with strategy. They'll give a little bit, but they won't break ties with Russia. They'll lean one week towards the Americans and another week towards imply a link towards the Russians. The key to it is Germany. And Germany is again demonstrating that it is not America's most important ally in Europe. Poland and Britain are America's most important allies in Europe because we do what we say. And the Germans, frankly, are still lost in this fog of peace.
And why is that, Julian? It is because of the, and then let me share. I on purpose, I will be, devil's advocate.
Please do, yeah.
At the end of the day, I'm, Polish.
Yeah.
And we are speaking about the security situation in my neighborhood, which is very acute. What many people suspect in Warsaw is that the German economy model is entirely based on access to the Russian cheap energy resources, and the Chinese market, and that structural issues are, uh, not allowing Chancellor Scholz to really make a change. And this is much bigger than any political process or decision making by one chancellor, because it's going to kill the social contract of Germany and its power within the European Union. And this is a big thing. And it was one of the assumptions that Putin made, initiating this invasion, that the structural thing was so powerful, and that with a quick victory over Ukraine, that would seal the Russian position in Europe. So, and it is, we fear that in Warsaw, and we're not going to let it happen anymore. And that undermines the construction of the European Union, Julian.
Yeah. I think you're being too kind to the Germans. I mean, the Germans are the super mercantilists. They've become that, the super free riders. They see international relations only in terms of mercantilism, trade, and whether it's dominating the eurozone so they can export cheap goods to indebted fellow EU member states, whether it's exploiting the Chinese market for their cars and their manufacturers, or whether it's consuming cheap Russian energy. The lengths to which they were willing to go, and the people with whom they were willing to deal to preserve that fragile structure, has put the EU and NATO at risk.
Yeah.
And still they do not acknowledge the responsibility of their power. Power is a curse as well as a blessing. You cannot hide from your own power, but Germany is trying hard to do that. And I have to say this because I've tried very hard to work with Germans. The Germans are great at organizing great conferences like the Munich Security Conference. They're great at talking about what others should do to make them safe. But they don't do what should do to make themselves and the rest of us safe. And some of this is political because the SPD coalition, with the Green Party and the FDP, is fragile. Part of it is Scholz's own lack of leadership, his weakness. Part of it is this mercantilist problem that Germany has, and part of it is a kind of exploitation of history. I think I might have told you before, but stop me if I have. But I got into big trouble when I wrote a piece in the Herald Tribune in the early noughties, when I talked about Germany, and I said that at the time, for 60 years, for 50 years, the West had told Germany that it couldn't do anything because of World War II, and now the Germans seem to spend the rest of their time telling us that it can't do much because of World War II. And there's still this tendency in Germany. Most of us regard modern democratic Germany as a completely different country to the one in the past. I think even Poles would acknowledge that, despite the terrible things that Nazi Germany did to Poland. But when it's convenient to the Germans, this is what frustrates me, is that they still use that argument to avoid why they're not investing in their armed forces so that NATO deterrence and defense is truly credible should the Americans be busy elsewhere, which, let's face it, could happen in the 21st century.
Oh, yeah.
So, I fully understand Poland's frustration with your neighbor. The rest of us are pretty frustrated with Germany as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it really seems that, hinged upon their decision, the future of Ukraine, lies. I mean, is dependent. Also, Polish security, all NATO eastern flank, future of the European Union, and even transatlantic alliance. Because if the United States figures out that Germany favors a continental consolidation in line with Mackinder's,
Yeah.
and then the Americans will play hardball. I mean, and
Well, the Americans will play hardball anyway because that's the Americans, and frankly, they're right to do that. But frankly, I wrote my PhD on what became ESDP and then CSDP many years ago,
Mhm.
and I believed in it, but I don't believe in it anymore because there's no hardcore at the heart of the project. It's all talk, endless summits, endless declarations, and nothing much happens.
Mm.
because Europeans are quite happy for the American taxpayer to bear the majority of the burden. But I
Yeah,
can foresee a situation when the American taxpayer starts saying, "Hey guys, we're kind of busy and we have our own problems like immense debt to deal with. You Europeans, and not to mention Indo-Pacific and China, you Europeans might have to, get your act together." And then you've got the British, who are now semi-detached and yet easily the strongest military power in Europe, and the French and the Germans falling out over future aircraft.
yeah,
So
exactly.
it's really quite a mess, Jacek. You would have thought that what happened in Ukraine would lead to some kind of consolidation, but it doesn't seem to be. A
Does
year on, it just
that
doesn't seem to be.
doesn't seem, and in Poland we have no illusions anymore. You know that, and that's why
You Poles have never had any illusions, and rightly so.
I actually, when we joined EU and NATO, we sort of felt being adopted by a father, NATO, security, and EU, macroeconomy, mother, and
Mm,
we arrived at the safe haven of the end of history in a way, sort of.
yeah,
And now we're waking up, and big time. This time around, big time. You see what we're doing towards our brothers in Ukraine, and our military is really thinking about a major change. Yeah, I'll get back to that, but maybe let's not change the subject because this is part of the
yeah,
bigger. But what are your observations from the warfare in Ukraine, especially in the context of Polish military reforms that we will implement? What do you think? What would be your sort of the main points, the focal points on which we should focus? What do you think? What are the for the history of warfare for the
yeah. The future of
war,
warfare.
yeah, for the future?
Um, well, first of all, concentrations of troops are extremely vulnerable if they have large digital footprints, particularly if your troops use mobile phones, which is not a very good idea. Second, many of the assets of battlefield mobility, traditional battlefield mobility, from strike aircraft to helicopters, are extremely vulnerable to anti air and anti tank systems. Third, that if you haven't got a truly effective disruptive electronic warfare element, then large formations are extremely vulnerable to attack. Small unit cohesion and small unit action, which ironically is what the British Army has been teaching the Ukrainians, because that's the British way of war, has proved extremely useful and successful. And above all, it's all information and intelligence led.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to have a real time, increasingly fast strategic and battlefield picture so that you can act on information extremely quickly.
So precision is killing concentration. The principle of mass is being undermined by the principle of precision
And maneuver.
and maneuver. Quick maneuver aligned with the beautiful C2 and C4 and C5, which is preferably real time and immune, right? Immune
Yeah,
to the enemy's action. And of course, long fires, right? I mean,
long fires, absolutely vital. Um, but, I would advise Poland not to do what the British have done. The British Army has been, the mass of the British Army has been sacrificed in pursuit of maneuver
Mhm,
because maneuver is expensive. And now the mass of the British Army is too small. In fact, much of the discussions in London about this revised review are about that.
mhm,
That the British Army will have to be bigger, even though we're a maritime power, because we simply can't fulfil our obligations under the NATO defense plan.
mhm.
Um, Poland is going to be an army-centric, land-centric power. That is your geography. I would strongly advise more maneuver, more professional forces, because professional forces are the ones that can exploit advanced capability, but also do not sacrifice the mass of it, so that you can really um, supply, put, really a significant number of highly effective formations into the field. That if things go wrong, as they do in battle, junior leadership is sufficiently strong to be able to maintain momentum. That's the other thing that the Russians have found, which is their so-called kontraktniki have proved, ineffective. And the reason is because they haven't solved in their modernization programs the very issue which makes Western forces so capable, which is junior leadership, whether it's sergeant level or up to captain level. That the individual has a strategic picture and understands their actions within that frame. And if they're cut off, they will continue to achieve their objectives because of their wider understanding of the mission. That is leadership. And here again, the Russians have shown themselves, not for the first time in history, to be incompetent.
Mm, yeah. The debate in Poland, given everything that we have just mentioned,
Yeah,
this doubts and faltering of Germany, and NATO being sometimes empty shell without real forces, extended nuclear deterrence thing, nuclear threats, and of course, one great fight that the Ukraine army is putting up, approaches of the Baltic friends and the Scandinavian friends, and so on. We are in the midst in Poland debate because the way we will shape the military strategy will have a huge impact on our relationship with the friends, even with Germany and with the United States. Because simply geography is pushing us towards the active defense at least.
of
You know,
course.
but that poses difficult questions for the Article 5, NATO. This mutual defense thing and stuff. And we are at the crossroads because we would like to have long-range fires. Also, General Zaluzhny, commander of the Ukrainian army, is advocating for the Ukrainian indigenous long-range strike reconnaissance complex to hit the Russian, to stabilize the equilibrium, right?
Yeah.
And theoretically, Poland should also wish for that. And we should also field our own system capable of hitting targets up to the Ural Mountains to stabilize. Because if there is no other way of stabilizing the situation, you need to deter by that, right? So,
Yes, but then I would advise Poland to use the famous Nike advertising slogan: "Just do it. You're a leader, Poland. You've
yeah, but
been
sometimes politically we feel a little bit, fearful of stepping out of this NATO cohesion thing, which is a big temple. You know what I mean, right?
I know exactly what you mean, but I think your history makes it perfectly clear that Poland must always take steps to ensure that Poland's security is first and foremost assured, whatever happens with allies and partners. Now, I think that Poland making very clear statements will drag others along with it. Um, because my fear, frankly, is that the United States becomes overstretched and the world over. Britain is building a powerful new navy. We have new frigates, new destroyers, new aircraft carriers, new nuclear attack submarines. We're building four enormous ballistic nuclear powered missile submarines. Um, and the message is clear, given the size of the British Army. Okay, yeah, we'll pay lip service to continental Europe, but we're looking after ourselves. No one's going to really think about attacking Britain because we can wipe them out with nuclear weapons. And that means that we're becoming increasingly attached. And it strikes me that what Poland has to do is to drive Germany. Now, that might sound a bit grand, but that is in effect what you've got to do. You've got to hold Germany to account for Zeitenwende. You've got to push Germany to modernize its armed forces in parallel with your own, because the land deterrent backbone of the alliance going forward will be that Berlin-Warsaw axis.
Yeah.
Look at a map. That's it.
Julian, I think either we will convince Germany to do it, and then we'll build fortress Europe, however bizarre it sounds, in terms of history. But history sometimes is surprising.
Legitimately strong democratic Europe.
Yes, sort of EU project and NATO project realigned and keeping Russia at bay out of it, with Ukraine somehow aligned. But if we do not convince Germany, because they will be keeping their fantasies about having Russia inside Europe, then we will move to recreate the Intermarium alliance.
Yes, I can understand that, but look at it this way, Jacek. You have a wonderful opportunity in Poland because of history. You could legitimize Germany's real Zeitenwende by actively presenting to Germany a strategic partnership between Poland and Germany with clear visions about force goals. Now, doing that doesn't mean the Germans can't maintain a kind of Hamel-like dual-track dialogue with Russia. But all you're doing is building in an insurance policy with Germany. And if Poland gives Germany blessing, and openly so, that is a powerful incentive for the Germans, given history, the very history that too many German politicians still continue to hide behind. We'll continue to give you the intelligence. The intelligence is 70-80% American and British, with the British 50% of that American-British partnership, given GCHQ and everything we do. You'll always have that access, and but we've got to shove Germany, and I think you're more likely to shove Germany in the right direction towards credible deterrence by focusing on a plan with the Germans than you are by claiming reparations for World War II, important though they are.
I agree with
I really think that Poland, if there's a problem with Poland, and I'll say this as a blunt friend of Poland, is that you're uncertain about leading, but you are leaders. You're not comfortable with leading, but you're the country that has ideas. You're the country that has dynamism. Economically, you have dynamism. In
Yeah,
so many ways, you have dynamism.
the,
So get over it and lead.
that is true, Julian, but the Germans will never accept that we will be recreating the Commonwealth in the East. I mean, in the modern way, the Intermarium. For example, because at the end of the day, it may end up with a formal alliance with Ukraine, with some sort of American extended nuclear deterrence towards Ukraine as a sort of a peace deal. And Poland will be providing the conventional, and Germans are against it because
I know
that
that. I know they are.
undermines their power in Central and Eastern Europe.
But I think part of the problem is we tend to see everything in terms of very rigid architectures. The future of NATO is going to be a series of bilateral and trilateral coalitions
Mhm.
that interact with each other through the standards that NATO provides. There'll be the traditional Anglo-American strategic partnership. There'll be the Franco-German thing, whatever form it takes. There'll be a Scandinavian thing. Um, and they'll all be kind of mutually supportive and not exclusive, but they won't drag people into other people's problems. And I can see no reason why the missing piece of that jigsaw, which is a really strong Warsaw Berlin axis, um, should not be built. Because I'm sure that most of the other powers, including my own country, would welcome that. Because you are literally the heart of Europe. You are the pivot around NATO's 360 degrees turns, particularly now that Finland and Sweden will join the alliance. So I think it's this is the moment for Poland to lead, and I hope that Poland's up to the challenge.
I hope so too. We will see, and I think that's a good moment to pause our conversation because I hope that I will convince you to record another one.
Always a pleasure, Jacek. Great fun.
Thank you very much. Our guest today was Professor Julian Lindley-French, the Alphen Group. Thank you, Julian. That was, of course, awesome. Thank you
My
very much.
pleasure, Jacek. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Good day too. Thanks.